A real world EX. Man, Timir, that sucks. Especially this close to the holiday. I know it's super stressful and everything like that, but hearing you're having a rough go of it, that's never good. Uh, yeah, I was kind of in the boat with Sean. Well, not quite in the boat with Sean. I can always come up with something to talk about, but it takes a lot to upload and everything like that. And I'm just starting here at around 2:30 ish. I finally got to hop on the computer, see what's going on in the real world today, and hearing about the trials and tribulations that happen to befall you. Um, so yeah, I was thinking of a couple things I was going to talk about. And one, like, not necessarily story wise, but something that always fascinates me is like I kind of grew up on real world in generations, and and it wasn't like that I was put under the impression of, it was something that I had implied or inferred, was that a lot of other games, like Generations, like the Triumvirate, I guess you could say, I don't want to say like Generations, was like the thing that all of the others copied, but specifically that like the template that I learned from Generations is probably something pretty similar to what other games used. And it wasn't because Generations was first or anything like that. I don't think it was from history lessons and stuff like that. I can't remember. I think Keith was telling me about that, but I forget what it was because it was probably later, something like that, and I didn't write it down. That all being said, what I was getting at is it's always interesting to see the different systems that different DMs put out there and the differences that exist within games, and the similarities too. I guess I was looking over, I was getting a few minutes to do a little work on a character there, and I was looking up like, what the heck does that stat do? And it was like meta and charisma is like your magical and your illusion resistance, how easily your willpower can be penetrated, stuff like that. And it's like there's all those little, like, I remember back in the day in Generations, like there was this obscenely long list of stats uh, that you could pick from, and it's like, and when I say obscenely long, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a way that it was very comprehensive because it was like everything that you could possibly think of was represented in a stat. And this is something we were talking about, I think, on the phone the other night, where I unfortunately had to hop off. Was like how D&D provides you with this pretty decent base format for a role playing game. And the thing I wanted to convey there was it was either the creators or like someone within like the D&D community, like it was like someone who like I think had a hand in creation, said that they always envisioned D&D, the tabletop game, as being a platform for players to come up with their own stuff. It's like kind of a platform for imagination. And that was something that was always like, that's something that always made me think, is like a lot of the people I had interactions with who played D&D, they just play it by the rules and everything like that. And it's like the original premise was to use this to learn your imagination and then expand upon it. And I think I mean, like I said, I don't think real world was steeped originally in D&D, but in a way it did just that. Is D&D gave you an idea for systems, for I think I always talk about like why I hate Harry Potter so much is because the Avada Kedavra spell is a magical kill spell with no cooldown, no personal cost, and you can just basically free cast it. Like Defense Against the Dark Arts is completely useless because anyone who is anybody is going to have this instant kill spell that is like basically unblockable, and if you're hit with it, you're instant dead. Like there's no defense against it. It might be not be unblockable. I think I saw someone deflect some Avada Kedavras in that one fight scene, but like I said, that kind of goes with the idea of the basis of it is in D&D, where it's like they created this magical system, and it's like, okay, so mages have this many spells a day that they can use. They can choose to, like, they spend like an hour in the morning to like learn their spells. So if they want to, like, if they think they're going to be fighting some goblins today, like they'll put in some different spells that might be better for goblins. Or if something's weak versus fire or ice, like it requires a certain amount of planning. Sorcerers are different in that they have like a raw connection to like the magical conduit, so they have their spells. They don't have to learn them, but they usually get less slots. So like there's definitely some trade off there. And then like in the tabletop game Mage, it's like you had to deal with Scourge, and it's like every magical action you took weighted on your character, because it, especially magical actions that defy the natural laws of things. So it's like if you're uh, taking a life, if you're growing a mountain or something like that, like depending on the size of the action is the amount of scourge that you incur. And it's like you basically build up scourge and then slowly bleed it off over time. So it's like while you have insane magical powers, you're also very shackled to the realms of reality, to the point where you can't, like, you could do these fantastical acts, but like you basically get driven mad um, if you over scourge yourself. And I think the other thing with it is like people who witness magical acts somehow give you more scourge, so it's like they drive you insane faster. So it's like you can't be out there if you were to like erupt a volcano in the middle of a busy town square. Like that would pretty much like instantly fill your scourge up and make you insane, and you probably lose your character. So it's like you can't do stuff like that, and it's a way to kind of keep the players in rein and everything. But it was just like it's one of those ones. At the very least, it was a system of checks and balances to to keep things interesting. Like like I said, without balance and everything like that, like it kind of sucks. And like real world has that, but it also doesn't have that. Like it has it in the sense that you get what you get. I mean, like some races are stronger than others. Some races are faster than others. Some are more gifted at certain things. Like it's not perfectly balanced in the sense that everyone starts on equal footing, but it's balanced in the sense that it's usually balanced in the sense of I guess a greater universe, and that's something I thought was always pretty cool when it came to like real world and like the D&D thing. Like that was like the thing I said about D&D is like real world takes it so much further, whereas like in D&D you have dice rolls. Now the dice rolls can be good and bad. Like you can have good dice rolls where it's like you're fighting an opponent that's stronger than you. So what that means is your dice rolls are more difficult. So you might need normally a 10, like a 10 out of 20 to succeed. To do a more powerful opponent, you might need a 15 out of 20, or like let's say Castle's going up against Stargazer. Let's say I might need a 1 in 20 to actually like land a punch and knock him out. It's like in real world that just wouldn't happen. Like you wouldn't get that dice check for that because the power level gaps are so wide. Whereas in D&D, like there's always some slim chance like of a critical success. You're never put. I don't think. Well, I don't know. I'm just gonna say this, but I think you're never put in a position where you can't potentially succeed. I think like it's your chances go down. Like it might be even more than a 1 in 20. Like you might need a real back-to-back 20s or something crazy like that for like some insanely out of the things. Like maybe Cass and Stargazer was a bad example, but basically like the good side of things is you can fight up a lot easier. Like we think of easier in the sense that in real world, like you would have to use your wits, but like if the character is more intelligent than you and faster than you, like it's going to be even harder. Like see, every stat that they add on that they're better than you at, it becomes that much harder for you to outthink them, outsmart them, out clever them, like whatever way to do it. And like to apply your cleverness to make up for your speed or something like that. It becomes more and more difficult. Whereas in D&D, it's like you just have like a more difficult dice roll. Like you might need a slightly higher number. Now on the flip side to that, there are critical failures, which is something I'm very grateful that is not in D&D. So your character can be an expert climber. Like they spent their lives in mines and stuff like that, and like crawling out of holes and climbing down mine shafts, and like they have this backstory of they get like this +5 bonus to any climbing feats. You can still get into a situation where you're going down a pretty narrow, not let's say narrow, like and not all that steep cliff, and you can roll for it, and let's say because you get a +5 to it, like you only need a 5 out of 20 to succeed. You can still roll that 4 and completely fall down face first on this cliff, and like what it does is it's like success or failure is still very RNG. Like if you're really bad at rolling dice, if you tend to roll like those 1s to 5s and stuff like that, like even actions where like DM, I tie my shoe. All right, player, roll for it. And you roll a 1. It's like you end up going to tie your shoe, slipping and falling over. Your dagger falls out and like plunges into your chest. Like that's something that can happen with a critical failure. Usually we view that in like real world as like the DM screwing you over or messing with the player or something like that. When things happen that bad, or like if you've plummeted your luck stat somehow, stuff like that can happen. But like it doesn't happen on something that we should. Like I said, it doesn't happen as often. Whereas in D&D, like everything that you do like that. Now the DM might not always make you roll for that kind of thing, but like there's a lot of things out there that would seem like pretty basic actions that sometimes the DM might ask you to roll on. And then when you get that critical failure, or when you get that dice roll that's like a 2 or a 3 or something like that, man, do you mess up. And critical failures are always hilarious because if you roll 1, excuse me, sorry, the basic, I think like in the DM manual is like it basically plays up the idea that a 1 is a critical failure. It is a fantastic failure. It is like above and beyond. It's like you go to chew a piece of gum and instead you bite your tongue off, or something absolutely terrible like that. Or you try to shoot an orc in the eye, and you trip over a stone and instead shoot your companion in the back. Like it's like worst possible scenario kind of thing. Like almost like divine intervention to screw you over, which like I said kind of goes in line with how some of the things happen in real world, like with someone dropping their energy or something like that. Like, damn, I'm so fast. How can I drop my energy? It's my energy. Yeah, stuff like that. Like that's critical failures. That's like that's how I always imagine those things. Like the DM had a set of dice behind him. And he's like, "Well, player, you rolled a 1 on that one. You critically failed." What? That's a perfect example of what a critical failure looks like in D&D. But like real world kind of gets rid of that for the most part. And like I said, kind of bases it more on stats. So it's like if you see, I know Sean joked about like, oh, I just kind of play out what I think what happened. It's like, yeah, no, I kind of believe that there's a lot of NPC sheets back there and everything like that. And even then, like I'll say something is to Unleash is like, because it's a very new game, like you might run into NPCs like I think like Keith in his last session ran into an NPC that I did not anticipate him striking up anywhere near the conversation that he did with it. So like as the DM, you kind of have to fill in the blanks. Like, well, what is this NPC gonna do? Like, what is his expertise on the fly? D&D tends to be a little bit more rigid because you have like the story played out and you pretty much keep the players on track, or at least try to. Um, so there's a lot less free form to things. It's like with real world, it's like you send them out there, they might have a story, they might like wander off the path pretty heavily. So it's like you have to kind of come up with on the fly what abilities they have, and then like even then, like whenever you're fighting someone, especially if you don't have like the established NPC sheet down there, you have to to kind of like fill in the blanks. Like, okay, this player is this NPC is that. Like, how do you weigh their intelligence and their physical capabilities when it comes to fighting versus like the intelligence and the physical capabilities of another? Is like if they're closely matched, like that intelligence becomes a lot more important for being able to circumvent like certain things. And then even then, like whenever you do a character, it's like hey, this character was born and raised a pit fighter. He was born and raised the pits. He's going to have this many years of experience in this style of fighting. How does that play up against someone who is trained in the military or something like that? It's like there might be a little bit of unpredictability that the other, like the military training doesn't allow for, or doesn't accommodate for. So it's like they might have an edge in that scenario, or it might just be that they're less that they are less polished than the military fighter, and the military fighter has the edge over the pit fighter. Um, there's a lot of things like that happen behind the scenes in an instant. Like whereas in D&D, it's like you've got to like fights take so much longer because like even in real world, I'm going to jump around a little bit here. In real world, sometimes fights can take an amazingly long time, especially with very fast characters. Like if you guys have ever seen Hunter x Hunter, the last fight with the King Ant. It's like, I forget, is it 1 or 2, maybe 2, it's like 1 to 3 episodes, but it's like the first fight in an anime I've seen where they kind of fully address the speed at which people move. So there is a narrator basically explaining what happens while this fight goes down, and it's like they are. I guess like I would say that they're pretty much on like a Super Saiyan type level. So it's like the people around them are moving so insanely slow, but because these beings are so fast and so powerful, like it's like it takes a long time. And I know like DBZ's famous for it's like Frieza taking 5 minutes to blow up a planet and taking however many episodes it was. But it's like this episode really kind of made you feel the speed at which these people move, and it's like the actions that they take and how each action plays out, but still so much time, so little time passes in the outside world. Um, that I think that anime did it better than DBZ when it came to the passage of time and fighting. Tying it back to real world, like that's something where it isn't like in D&D, like an encounter can be an entire session, just because of the rules and the positioning and the action points and everything like that. Like, you know, the amount of stuff that you have to do, the amount of actions you can take per turn, stuff like that. Whereas in like real world, like a fight can be over in an instant, or it can take, you know, it can take an insanely long time depending on the level of each, you know, the opponents and the matchup that exists there. And yeah, so like in that regard, it's like the fights that you end quickly become a little bit more satisfying as long as you're not ending every fight quickly. But then it also makes the fights that take a long time seem more satisfying because of the opponent you're fighting. So it's like where in D&D, it's like fights are pretty static. Like there's usually not many fights that are over that quick because of the way the the game manual tries to scale its opponents to your level. Whereas like um, yeah, you can get into some stereos where like you're outclassed and everything like that. But like in in real world, like it happens. You know, it's like you never know what you're getting into, and like that's why people kind of adapt different fighting styles when it comes to real world. Like you know, it's like the whole idea of killing someone in their sleep, or whenever people fight in real world, it's usually less to get an opening and more to get like an instant kill, like because you can't afford to fight someone, you can't afford that cockiness of the thrill of battle or anything like that, because it's always life and death in real world, especially when fighting unknowns. Now, if you're fighting like someone you're very familiar with, you might be able to go a little bit more back and forth, but like most people's fighting style revolves around like getting in that cheap shot or getting in that quick kill or something like that to quickly dispatch an enemy, because you can't afford anything other than that. That's something I personally in Unleashed wanted to try to get away from a little bit. Like there's some things in my fighting styles where it's like I forget what the rating is. Like there's a rating in fighting styles that is basically flourish or flare, and what it is they are fighting styles that specifically with high ratings in flourish allow you to effectively either create distance or create opportunity through more flashy maneuvers. Whereas like usually in a lot of other games I think that we've experienced is when you try those flashy maneuvers, that just gets you killed. Like you're trying to do that double backflip to stomp someone down on the ground, like they grab you out of there by the neck and slam you down to the ground. Like no, I think it works. I think it works a little bit better for my game at least, because everyone is a little bit closer together when it comes to power level. Like everyone's still in that same power class, whereas in like a lot of the other games, like the Triumvirate, like because they're so old, like you coming in with a newer character or you being a much older character against newer characters, like it's very skewed, and you can't get away with that kind of stuff. So that was something I was kind of pushing for with the relaunch of Unleash, is that everyone is within the same realm of power. Now there are going to be people who are more powerful than others, obviously because of the powers and abilities they take, but like on base stats alone and everything like that, like unless you go very specific paths, people aren't going to be disappearing from your sight based on like your reflexes and stuff like that, which is something that's very common in I think is, well, I would say very common, is much more common in other games, especially when you don't make fast characters. Um, and like I said, it's also a product of time and like established NPCs and things like that. I kind of meandered here, but like that's I was hoping to give Time here some content and everything like that, but you know how like that meandering thought process went. But yeah, like I guess like the long story short of it was I was kind of like going back on the idea of like real world versus of D&D, and like how I think like Real World inadvertently accomplished what D&D set out to do, in the sense of creating a more freeform game with a more interesting and deep set of laws that govern the universe. Um, like I said, like whether it be magical systems or the way we handle stats, the way we handle fights. Like I think the way fighting is handled in Real World is definitely top notch, because everything happens both so fast and so slow. Like moves can be planned out very specifically and have very very focused effects. Whereas like in D&D, the example I used of cutting the giant's Achilles tendon, like it just kept stomping around after that because I did like 2d4 worth of damage. It didn't count as any kind of aggravated thing. It didn't like cripple it or anything like that, because I didn't use any kind of crippling blow, because my character was like an elf archer that, while okay with daggers, like doesn't have an ability to specifically crippling blow. Where I think some fighters do get something like that that prevents movement. So it's like, despite the fact that I did what would be a crippling blow, and I didn't get a crippling blow because the power wasn't crippling blow. Whereas in like in Real World, like that stuff doesn't exist. Like if you you have special abilities that will do stuff like that, like not necessarily crippling, like inflicting a status effect, but like usually like, they might have things like if they're sapping someone's power or whatever. Like there's like an infinite amount of things for Real World. Um, but yeah, like you don't you basically inflict your own statuses based on your actions. Like if you go for the eyes, you might cause blindness or like temporary blindness. Like removing that sense from the fight can be very potent, but like for a fighter that is fighting based on energy sense, like it might not be as potent. It all depends on the fighter. But like I said, you feel like your input has a lot more agency, I guess, in Real World, which is I think something what D&D had always aimed for, but it kind of kept it simple for the masses, so that people could get into it and then kind of expand it on their own. Whereas I think like most people that pick up D&D games though are pretty by the books, which is kind of funny. Which like it just might speak to the way we approach things. Whereas like most people tend to stay within the lines, whereas Real World is very much paint your own adventure. Um, and like I said, there's definitely a lot more work that goes into it, I think, like as a DM of Real World versus a DM of D&D, because like D&D you kind of have the story set out before you, or you at least have story paths in the books that players can quest and then the loot that they get and everything like that. Whereas like D&D, it's like it's all on you. Like every NPC, um, every action they take, their backstories, the environment around you, it's like there's a which is like I always throw out respect to the DMs and everything like that, and why the ratings are what they are, as far as like why you usually don't see like a DM have a overly low rating in something, because like they do a good job of crafting of the world, of like making you feel like that you've stepped inside it, whether it's like the sights. It's like one of the ones that I think that always got me was like in storytelling, it's very easy, and this is something I struggle with as we bounce all around this topic and hopefully find an end at some point, is something I always struggle with, and it's something I look back on some of my sessions that I personally DM, is that I feel like that there are moments where I get caught up, or I guess it'd be like the vessel gets caught up in the story, maybe even the DM. The DM gets caught up in the story, and because of it, he he doesn't properly convey as much as he would like about the environment of the surroundings. If you're getting into a fight with someone, it's like, yeah, as a player you might not want to hear how green the grass is or anything like that, but like I feel like it paints it's like, yeah, there's it's a tricky thing between creating flow of the story and creating ambience of the story. So it's like, you fighting on like a freshly fallen snow, and like you hearing the cracks of each footstep kind of like digging into the snow, and the silence, the overall silence, because of the way sound or the sound snow absorbs sound, so it's like everything is dead silent, versus like you basically running at someone to fight them. It's like, on the one hand you create uh, a rich environment that better sets the scene. On the other, you create an action-packed series of events that tends to ignore some of the world around you. And like I said, it's something that I at least struggle with. Is sometimes I will get caught up and lose track. And like I said, I want to say caught up as speaking negatively, but it's like caught up in the flow of battle, neglecting the environment, which might help the story flow better. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but like it's something I look back and it's like, oh man, like there was something that happened. Like I think some people were talking about like void space is like you can literally, the way I had described it, and I'll toot my own horn here for a second, I guess, is like it's something that it like stuck out in my mind is when people were talking about like void space, like you knew, like players knew how awful that place was because of the way it was described. Whereas I think before, like sometimes like people would pop in and out of it, and the DM wouldn't go through, like they wouldn't go through that, like, and obviously you don't need to reiterate it every time you go back there, but like missing out on that experience takes away from what's being affected to your character, and I think that's something that, especially like the Triumvirate DMs, like really like most of the DMs with Threat World and stuff like that, like they usually manage to find that pretty good balance of descriptors and flow, like matching those two things out. Whereas like D&D, I don't think worries about that anywhere near as much. Like you get an idea of the surroundings, like oh, it's a forest, there's some wildlife, stuff like that. But you don't get like the sights, the sounds, the smells, the creatures that you see, the actions that they take. It's like real world just takes it deeper. On all regards. Like I said, I say this when I because what I was looking at was I was updating characters' stats on some things like the DM stats, because like the players get like the basic strength, meta, intelligence, charisma, endurance, but like the DM has to take into account like any boosts that you got to all the secondary stats that aren't listed, that are basically behind the scenes stuff for the DM. So yeah, like that's how it got me thinking. It was like man, like you know, in D&D, like there's no combination of stats or anything like that to get you certain things. It's just like you weigh, you know, you roll. If you have a strength check, you have a strength check. If you have a dexterity check, you have a dexterity check. Like you don't have a strength and meta check to see how many affected targets you can affect with ability. That's usually written into the spell, but like it's hard written as opposed to like you being able to grow and expand it. But like that's kind of the start of how this video started. Hopefully this gets up before your day's overtime here, and hopefully it gives you something to listen to. All right, peace out.